Good afternoon, everybody. This is Bonnie Vandermeulen, Training Coordinator for Wisconsin Facets. On behalf of our entire Wisconsin Facets staff, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Today, our webinar is entitled Spotlight on Reading, What Parents Need to Know. Our presenter for today's webinar is Cheryl Ward. Before working on behalf of students who struggle learning to read, Cheryl was a healthcare administrator for many years. Her interest and her knowledge about dyslexia was greatly enhanced from her youngest child being diagnosed with dyslexia. Cheryl is the past president of the Wisconsin branch of the International Dyslexia Association, is a founding member of the Wisconsin Reading Coalition, and a member of the Quality Education Coalition. It is my great honor to introduce to you Cheryl Ward. Cheryl?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for tuning in today, and I apologize, we did have technical difficulties last November. So today we're going to be doing a back-to-back seminar. So today, this first one, a Spotlight on Reading, we're going to end probably around 45 to 50 minutes so we can set up for the second meeting that is to come, the component skills of reading. So it's going to go rather quickly, and hopefully I will not cough or sneeze. I've got quite a cold going on. So let's just start right away. All right, so we know why reading is important. Here we've got a question, but we know that reading is required. It's the gateway skill. It supports all foundational academic learning. It's the primary way that you grow your vocabulary and develop your complex language beyond 4th grade and through high school and college. We know that reading actually builds that area, builds in the brain the connections that help maintain and grow your actual intelligence and background knowledge in life. All these things add to that brain function. And this is reading is a requirement to acquire all information as you go on life's journey. It's certainly a big requirement in the 21st century as we become more and more dependent on reading. And we know that being a strong and good and competent reader certainly improves your emotional health, your self-concept, and can make you healthy psychologically. So we have to start with the facts, because the facts really are that of more than 5 or 50 million American school kids, we have clearly 20% or more than 10 million kids are struggling with those basic reading skills. And we know we also have a significant problem even with high school students that graduate, students not reading proficiently, not reading as expected. So what happens? They're not prepared for their post-secondary careers, whatever that may be. So why is it important to society as a whole? Well, it goes without saying that illiteracy affects the economy greatly, because we're having to do remedial coursework, we aren't living up to potentials, we're making poor healthcare decisions, poverty is increased, we want participants and our citizens to participate in democratic elections and politics, and without literacy that's impoverished. There's more social problems that can come to illiterate populations. We have prisons that are filled because of choices that are made by desperate people that are illiterate. And so we demand higher levels of literacy to get better jobs and to move our economy forward. So more suffer harm from illiteracy than from parental abuse, accident, and all childhood disorders combined. Now that's a pretty heavy statement, but nonetheless, this was what was found by people studying reading and the effects of reading. And that reading fits into the cyclical cycle of reading failure. If you have trouble reading, you're not going to meet the demands in school. You might be absent. You might be clowning around. You might not be paying attention. You very well might drop out. You very well may make other choices, whether it's crime or getting involved in having a baby early, which can lead, we know, to poverty. And again, the cycle can continue. So what happened? We had it as a nation. We started looking at the nation and our reading and looking at what is going on. And so in 1998, the Academy of Science was petitioned and asked by Congress with the National Institute of Childhood Health and Human Development to look at reading, to look at all the reading studies out there. What is going on? How do we teach kids to read? And it resulted in the report of the National Reading Panel. In that report, and I hope you can see this, I'm partially covered up here, kids who successfully learn to read master 3 skills. They understand that the letters that represent our sounds of our language, known as the alphabet, they understand that there's a correlation. They can read and gain meaning out of those squiggly lines, and they're able to do it quickly and frequently or fluently. So any disruption in any of the components will throw off a child's development and diminish the opportunities for the child. And what we know from the research, we know how does a good reader learn to read? What are those skills? How do they learn to read? Why do some students fail? And what is that relationship between our spoken language and reading? And what we can do to help students and learn to overcome any reading problems. So the changes outlined to prevent reading difficulties is really one of accountability for our educators in elementary schools. This is where we need teachers very well trained to be able to teach our kids these discrete component skills, which we'll talk about in a minute. But we also, that report pointed out that many teachers aren't simply adequately prepared, that they need ongoing professional development, mentoring, and collaboration with their colleagues. And sadly, that's not always in place, and is rarely in place in most environments. We also need change in regards to our state certification requirements of what it is to be a teacher of reading. Key concepts about the way language works, the information between early literacy and those skills and what we call conventional reading, reading for meaning, need to be addressed. We need to look at those skills. We need to change the certification. We know this needs to play out at the local level because our schools need staff development opportunities if they're going to keep up with the research and the science of the reading brain. So how do we know how a student is doing with reading outcome? Well, since about 1992, we've been measuring this across the country with a standardized assessment called the National Assessment of Educational Progress, and it's referred to as NAEP. And here in Wisconsin, we have really began to look at the NAEP in more earnest since about 2011. And this allows a comparison of students within the state and state to state. So no more can you really count on these, just a myriad of different comparisons state to state. You could be a strong reader in one state and a weak reader in another state. That's always dependent. The NAEP equalizes all of that. So this is a very important measure. So we look at 4th grade reading because we tend to teach reading through 3rd grade in most environments, and then at that point we're really looking at more comprehension and expansion of literacy. So those foundational skills are prior to 4th grade, and we look at them as a collective, all students in Wisconsin, and we look at subgroups. in 4 categories. Those that are strongly advanced in their reading skills, those that are proficient, and that's where we want, and those that are basic or far below basic. So because this is a national measurement, states reacted in different ways. Some states began to look how they were teaching reading immediately and began to make some important and some good changes. States like Massachusetts and Florida and Delaware and Georgia and Washington, D.C. But Wisconsin really was pretty committed to current and ongoing practice. And so our NAEP scores have really been very stagnant over time. So here's an example of just a comparison here, Wisconsin versus the nation. And you can see that in 1994, it appeared that we were doing a pretty good job with reading as compared to the national average. And here, this is from 2013, we are slightly below the national average. So you can see there hasn't been much movement. More specifically here, if we look at the 2015 Nation Report Card in 5th grade, we look at roughly 65% of 4th graders in the country and Wisconsin are reading proficiently, and even more 8th graders are reading below proficiently. So we know we have a problem, so it's important for any of you on the call here to understand that we must pay close attention to the science of reading. But why is it so hard? Because most of us don't realize how hard teaching is. But most of us also don't realize that reading is not a natural function. We know that man evolved to speak. We don't go to speaking school. But reading is really, by all intents and purposes, we haven't been reading very long. Hundreds of years, and even in some cultures, for some readers, maybe 4,000 years. But typically, when you think of reading, especially as it pertains to westernized thinking, the masses have not been reading. So reading is something that has to be taught, where speaking is natural and embedded in the brain. And of course, all our brains are not wired the same. And so, as I say, the brain was not designed to read. It relies on multiple systems within the brain to read appropriately. And so it's very important to understand how individuals meet the reading challenge, and teaching must be different for these differences in our brains. So we know that teaching, in fact, is rocket science, and teachers have a large job on their hands and aren't getting the support that they need to be able to assist our students. So if we look at a normal distribution, this is kind of a very old slide, you can see, but traditionally we teach down the middle, and we've got tails on each side. And so if you think of it, kids are scattered all throughout this slide. And so it doesn't matter if you're talking IQ or reading, you're going to have kids all over the distribution curve. And so it's important that you understand where they're placed and what gaps are in their skills. So here are the 3 language processes in the brain. We have areas for phonological processing, that is hearing the sounds of language and being able to manipulate those sounds of language. We have areas that connect them, the sound symbol areas, with the letters of our language representation. And then we also have the area where you can visually see that orthographic representation and be able to put sound to it in your head. And of course you need word meaning. So we have many different areas that may not be working effectively. Here's another representation of the modeling. And if you look down at the bottom, phonological processing and orthographic processing, the sounds linked to letters isn't good enough, but it's a requirement, because then you have to give it some kind of meaning. And then you have to put it into some context based on your background knowledge, based on semantics and syntax of language. So it's very complex. And being able to do this quickly and effortlessly relates to fluency. So you can do this quickly and fluently as to, to hold on to meaning. But you can really back off and even go back and make it more simplistic. And I think this is where I think it's most beneficial to most people to think about. You really have two components that lead to gaining meaning from print. One is being able to recognize those words, pull them off the page, and give them a sound of a represented oral language component. That's really what reading is. It's oral language written down. Once you have that, do you understand what the words are relaying? Both of those together come up with reading and gaining meaning from the print that you're reading. So that's kind of your simple view. But it starts with that foundational reading piece. Every student learning to read of any age, so it doesn't matter if you're 4 or 14 or 44 or 84, you have to be able to lift the letters off the page, associate them to your sound system, and you have to do it quickly, effortlessly, and accurately to be able to comprehend. And so we know by 5th, 6th grade for sure an individual is learning from what she reads, and that's the expectation. So we do have essential components, and you can see highlighted, and we have our 5 big components: phonemic awareness, which we'll talk about in more detail in a moment, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. But they're under a foundation of beginning with oral language, that speaking component. And of course, all this reading, we want people to be able to communicate their thoughts also in written form or written expression. So all of these together are all of the components that should be included in effective reading instruction. So phonemic awareness is components need to be explicit. They need to be very clear in instruction. We need phonics as well to be explicit and systematic. We need to be able to link sounds to symbols. We need to be able to have guided, careful oral reading so we can gauge a child's fluency. Are they able to read fluently? If not, we need to do something about it. We need to grow their vocabularies, and we know that the way you grow your vocabulary is primarily by reading. That's where you see vocabulary grown. We tend to talk to each other in very short little bursts. We don't use a lot of big vocabulary, but text does. And of course, the comprehension, you've got to get meaning from print. So here's the best slide, I think, that represents all of these components. These two major, that simple view. At the bottom, the word recognition. Do you hear the sounds? That phonological awareness. Do you understand what a sentence is? Do you know where a word starts and ends in a sentence? Can you isolate a word? Can you isolate a syllable? Can you hear the small parts, the smallest components within a word, which we'll play with in a moment? Are you able then to look at that representation of those squiggly lines on paper and pull it out, decode those words or read those words? Can you then reverse and spell those words? And can you do it quickly by sight? Those things are designated on here as a braided rope on the bottom here. And you can see a braid is dependent on tightness, isn't it? And as those skills become tighter, they braid together, and those skills need to come together in a tight braid, and will get stronger over years of instruction and practice. And that's in contrast to a whole nother set of skills, which is language comprehension. What kind of background, experience, and knowledge have you had? What kind of vocabulary knowledge development have you had? What do you know about how our language is put together? And what about inferencing and reasoning and all those things that we need for comprehension? You'll note that's not a braid, that is a wrapped rope, because they are supportive of one another rather than mandatory. However, those can be weaknesses. So any one of these weaknesses under language comprehension or word recognition can be a source of instructional need. And you want to include all of them together to be able to tighten the rope to get to, over time to get to independent reading. But to reiterate, the word recognition piece, if you are going to have trouble with any one of those components, any component of not being able to link sound to the letter representation, or you don't understand the letter representation, any of those are going to stop word recognition from happening. If word recognition is loose, even though comprehension can be strong, and when the majority of our readers, that is the presentation for a struggling reader, you're going to have an opportunity to help a child. So here's another representation. In this first part of this hour, we're going to be talking about the phonics and phonemic awareness. What are those things? So you can see it's all on oral language, and we're taking a journey to the top of the house, to the roof for comprehension. So you've got to get this bottom strong. Now I'm making an assumptive for our purposes today that oral language is intact, it's in place, there's strong oral language. But if you don't have strong oral language, which I'll talk about more in the second presentation, you can have more problems in phonemic awareness and in phonics because of that poor oral language foundation. So we're going to talk here, though, about phonemic awareness and phonics. So what does research say about phonemic awareness and predicting poor reading? We can determine with over 90% accuracy whether or not a child in kindergarten will be in the bottom 10% of readers in second grade by looking at the phonological awareness component of words and sounds, by looking at their vocabulary and looking at their sound symbol representation. The phonemic awareness of a child entering school is held to be the strongest single determinant of success in learning to read or fail. So this is highly important, and it's very complex. It deserves its own webinar over time to interested parties. But phonemic awareness is very important to have. Once it's intact, you can, often we can forget about it. But if you're struggling, this is often the vast majority of where the deficit is located. So it is part of phonological awareness. It relates to the 44 unique and smallest sounds, which are also called phonemes in our English spoken language. So it's the smallest sound component in your language. It has nothing to do with print. It can be taught, and it can be learned. But most reading curricula is not adequate in this regard for struggling readers. And it typically is overlooked in older or poor, weak readers, often assume that they must know this. And we certainly sadly know that our teachers haven't been prepared to teach phonemic awareness, nor are they supported in this endeavor to expand their professional development. So here's an example. I want you to know, guess how many sounds are in these individual words. O, go, box. Very basic words. So in O, we have one sound, a long O. In go, we have two sounds, the sound of G and the long R consonant, and again another long O. In box, we have four sounds, 3 letters, 4 sounds, because the X is related by a K sound and an S sound. That's the relationship. The student has to know that. This is a very simplistic example, but people might be surprised about how many teachers don't know this. Here's an example of the sound, long sound of A and how many different ways A can be written. And a student also will have to know that over time. Now, some students can grasp this. They see these patterns on their own. Their brains are wired in a certain way where they can, just gain that very quickly. But again, sadly, many kids don't. They will have to be taught things about these letter representations for the letter A, as in this example. And we also know that sometimes we have representations of sounds, or of letters rather, that have multiple sounds. So we have gown and grown, ow and o, eat, bread, steak. We have a long E, a short E, and a long A. And soup and round, we've got a oo sound and a ow sound. Again, this has to be taught. So we know that good readers are phonologically aware. They gain those skills. They can hear those sounds. They can put them to letters. They can make those sound symbol relationships, which is the alphabet principle. So they know that C sometimes says K, or sometimes it says an S sound, as in picnic, clap, city, central. And they know why that happens. They often can't articulate, but their brains have put that circuitry in place. Some kids can't do that. They do these skills rapidly and fluently. They have strong vocabularies. They know what multiple meanings mean. They have good grammatical skills, and they know how to put sentences together. So in kindergarten, we need to be able to be sure to focus that words have letters and letters relate to sounds. Recognition of letters, knowledge of writing concepts, and all the basic mechanisms of reading and writing should be put in place. And I think that we are really, from what I've seen, focusing some really nice attention on doing more and more of this in kindergarten. And in first grade, we need to really focus on those sound to letter relationships and practice with text, practice with fluency. And by the time you're in second grade, we should really be encouraging students to sound out words and to understand and identify unfamiliar words for instruction. So kids, this is what you're hoping you put in place for kids. But characteristically, for poor readers, they're going to guess. They're going to be looking at pictures. They're going to be relying overly on what's going on in the story. And sometimes they're going to be able to guess correctly, and that can be misleading to us. They have as I say, they have very limited phonemic awareness. They're not able to really sound those words out appropriately. They may not be able to even do that yet because of the deficit. They may be very labored in how quickly they can do this. And name, the sound of symbol. So they have to take so much energy into coding the words. So guess what? They're using all their energy in this way, so they're not always getting meaning out of that print. So what happens over time, which is kind of the rub here, is that everybody starts out at the same place, but the gap between a poor reader and an average expected progress becomes larger over time. So that gap. So the longer you wait to intervene, the harder it is to actually do so. So we know what's required for effective reading instruction. And we know the reading panel determined that many teachers lack the appropriate knowledge needed to effectively instruct students. And we know that they made recommendations to take a continuing ed, to keep current. And we know that they made recommendations to use science-based reading programs, and hence part of the problem. Science-based reading programs can be many things, whether they're good or bad, as long as they were based in some kind of science. And so I think sadly people chose some wrong, made some curriculum choices that weren't of benefit, particularly to those that struggled most. But I would like to to say that this is not teachers' fault, even though we're saying that teachers lack the appropriate knowledge needed to effectively instruct students. What you're really looking at is teachers not being appropriately trained and supported in the first place, working in structures with like-minded people and wanting to do the right things, but you've got to know what the right things are to be able to do it. So teachers just haven't been given the respect that they need to get this professional development, largely because you don't know what you don't know. So if we just focus on two questions that are very different. What is it about this student that makes her unable to learn? Is it the student's fault there, or what is it about the instruction that makes this student unable to learn? That is really what this is about. It's about instruction. It's not about the student. We know how we have demonstrated, the research had showed us that we can teach these students. It isn't about the student, it's about the instruction. So what's happening in our classroom? We've got a gap between what we know and the science of reading, and all the practice implications. We've got to align teacher training and practice with the science of reading to reduce that gap in student outcomes. We have to prepare high-quality teachers who are responsible for teaching our students learning to read. So that includes all those K through 3, K through 5 teachers, reading interventionists, special education teachers, anybody that's responsible for teaching reading. And we need to be able to not only prepare them, but we need to give them ongoing professional development. And we need to understand the strengths and the weaknesses of our teachers and have it be okay. Because we know that reading programs will not work for your child and will not create a proficient reader if the program is not appropriate to meet their weaknesses or their needs. If there's too many students in their class and focused on probably disparate needs, which likely often makes the pace of instruction inaccurate. So sometimes the pace of instruction is too rapid. So if some students just may need a slower pace. So it's really, it becomes a very, very challenging situation for a single classroom teacher to manage all of this. So we should be very empathetic and supportive, and that's why it's critical to address this as early as possible. So some of the components that we're looking for our teachers to have is we really want them to understand this letter knowledge, that the sounds that our various configurations of letter make. We need them to be able to manipulate the different sounds in language. They need to know the rules or the phonics of language, how the rules work to align to sound to letters. And we also need them to be able to do this, to teach so a student can do this by sight, quickly. We also need them to know how to look at multisyllabic words, bigger words, and be able to look at the chunks within those words and talk about the meanings of those chunks within the words, which we often talk about as roots, prefixes, and suffixes, and how to associate meanings and how to stabilize spelling. We need to talk about what kind of words. English is made up of Anglo-Saxon words, of Latin words, of Greek words, and certainly our higher level comprehension words, the majority are Latin, and in science and math we've got Greek, so we need to talk about these things. And all of these things will build our language comprehension and vocabulary. So there's an awful lot for teachers to know about knowledge, and sadly we don't often do this. So what happens between, for those of you on the call that are interested in knowing about reading, because typically you're worried about kids that aren't reading well, maybe your student that isn't reading well or reading well enough. And they might be identified as requiring special education. So what's going on between special education and general ed? You need to understand that the way you teach reading in either area, the way the brain learns to read is the same regardless if it's in general education or special education. It just is really determined by the amount of information that's required. Some brains need more, some need less. And the amount of practice. So the content of what you're going, and the different skills and the components, they are the same for both populations and for both, all these students. It's simply dependent on the amount of information and the amount of practice that a student needs to have. But for both student populations, you need to have a system of instruction that's sequential, that's built on instruction step by step. It needs to be clear, and that is the way a student is going to be able to get instruction that's meaningful for them. So a student that is in general education isn't learning reading differently than a student in special education. Everyone starts in the general education classroom, and so we're looking for instruction to meet needs for both of these student populations. The primary difference, as say, is intensity and frequency and how you scaffold into steps. But it isn't a special kind of instruction for a student with a reading disability as it is for a student without a reading disability. It might look like it's different, but it is not different. We still need to address those components of phonemic awareness, make sure they're intact, and for a proficient reader, they're going to be intact. In first grade, by first grade, they're going to be intact. But for students that struggle, we may need to revisit this. But the instruction is the same. It's just a degree of how much additional information and practice. So special education teachers need the same kind of preparation as a reading teacher in the general ed environment. They're equal partners. And we don't often think of them as equal partners, but they should be equal partners. They should be co-teachers. They should be collaborative. They should be able to consult. And it stands to reason that a special education teacher would probably have more, given an ideal circumstance, more opportunity to provide instructional remediation, because after all, that's where that student would be identified to receive additional services in reading. But yet our special education teachers are woefully unprepared when it comes to reading instruction for students that struggle. So for a teacher to be effective and to be able to teach a student to proficiency, they have to understand how to use instructional materials, and they have to understand the pedagogy of learning to read. And we have had the National Council on Teacher Quality has been looking at teacher preparation at the university level for quite some time now, and have determined that we have a long way to go here. We also need to be able to assess our students appropriately, and we have to be able to understand their trajectory over time and what kinds of things that they need. That requires using student data, outcome data, and we need to take those data points and then match it to instructional strategies. And then teachers have to be able to adjust those instructional strategies. But you're not going to be able to do that if you don't know what these individual components are, where the weaknesses are. We often hear about the student is weak in fluency. Well, why? We don't really go in and see. Is it because they can't decode the words? Is that the reason? Or is it a fact that they have working memory or processing issues? Or what other reason would it be? So we just say they have a fluency issue. So they can't do this without professional development. So we have different kinds of assessments that I think people need to understand, particularly those of you, that are parents. To be able to, we have students come into school as kindergartners, and now here in Wisconsin we do some universal screening. Are these students able to, perform as expected going into the school environment? What quick little indicator can we have to identify their performance and identify some level of risk for those students? We call this universal screening. So we can move right in and hopefully give instruction. And then, of course, along the way, we have to monitor any progress they're making, because this is what provides teacher with information to be able to match instruction or intervention to the needs of the student. So we do need to provide progress monitoring, particularly for students that are in need. And then for students that have needs, we really need to identify the discrete needs within a disability. So thinking of reading again, you can look at reading and do a diagnostic assessment, which can look at all these component parts, phonemic awareness and blending and phoneme manipulation and fluency and phonics. You can look at all of these tests to help fine-tune where the strengths and the weaknesses are, and that's a full diagnostic assessment that can either be done in school or outside evaluation. But these are different kinds of assessments, and if you have a struggling reader, you need to be able to have a good diagnostic assessment. So does the teacher incorporate the right instructional materials to meet these needs? Well, we know it's overwhelming. And this is where principals and administrators can come in and help teachers be successful. So teachers and principals, administrators need to understand the science at a macro level. And they need to be able to get and assist and support teachers getting the resources that are effective, research-based, that have evidence of effectiveness. And this is really the starting point. So teachers can be, it's all dependent on what kind of environment and how much their support systems around them know is going to determine how successful teachers can be to effectively help students become effective readers. So teachers have to have the right materials, and they have to have the ability to master these processes. And often we have a revolving door of programs, curricula, and staff themselves. And this is a really big obstacle, and it really gets in the way of having a consistent process of improvement. So you really need to be able to have a plan, and sadly that's not in place in a lot of environments either. We have to have, I keep going back to ongoing professional development. You have to be able to have ongoing professional development driven by data and assessments of these student profiles to be able to match the appropriate evidence-based science approach to that student to help that student remediate whatever reading weakness it is. So you really need to have a literacy program within a school led by leadership and teams that effectively monitor the process. So what can parents do?
And Cheryl, just to let you know, we have 5 minutes.
Okay, all right, good. Parents, I do not hesitate to talk to your child about what it is that they are being taught or what you're seeing with them. Sit with them, ask questions of your teacher, make sure you give them as much background information as you can. Do your part, in essence. Read with them. But the most important thing is to educate yourself about the essential components of reading. know that these components are out there. And if you have a struggling reader, and I've got some resources at the end, that you'll be able to read more about it. And I would not hesitate to ask questions of your teachers, of your school, about your administrators, of any concerns that you have, including your school boards. And don't be hesitant to ask your teacher if they're effectively trained to meet your child's needs. So because we want to have preventative action rather than waiting to fail, which is sadly too often an issue. Please do not be intimidated. Early intervention is much more effective and much faster than later remediation. So request an evaluation of your child's language and learning abilities if you need it. Explore accommodations and modifications if they need it in the classroom, speech to text, text to speech, particularly for your older readers. It's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. So I feel like I went so incredibly fast, you guys, because of the time. So I'm hoping, let me answer any questions that you have. This was really fast.
At this time, Cheryl, we don't have any written questions. Maybe you can just direct people to your email address if, in fact, they do have some in the future.
Okay. Yeah, you should see that up there. My email address, cacward@yahoo.com, if you have any questions. Any questions type? No?
No, none at this time. And so what I would also suggest, if people are interested, is that our follow-up workshop, the component skills of reading, will be beginning at just approximately another 12 minutes or so. And this will be recorded, and as these recordings will be sent to all of you that are in participation today and those that have missed as well. So I'm going to be stopping the recording at this time.